The human mind is a quirky thing. Sometimes the way that we might expect it to operate is not the way that it actually operates. So, for example, as people, we're constantly making judgments about other people. And these judgments can be significant or insignificant, but we make them all the time automatically and often unconsciously. And you might expect that the judgments that we make about individuals would be very similar to the judgments that we make about groups of people. But after all, groups of people are just a collection of individuals. But it turns out that the way that we feel about individuals is very different than the way that we feel about groups. And that ends up having some meaningful consequences that I want to tell you about. So to begin, let me give you a little bit of background about this idea. So one day when I was still in graduate school, I got together with a research collaborator for a meeting. But instead of talking about research the way that we typically would, we got entirely sidetracked and spent most of the time talking about this guy. So this is Roger Federer, who most people still generally consider to be the greatest tennis player of all time. And this was right around the time that Federer had won his 8th Wimbledon title. And so we were sitting there having coffee, just kind of marveling at Federer's persistent dominance, right? Just kind of being in awe of everything that he's been able to accomplish in his career. And during the course of this conversation, the thought occurred to me that it's a little bit weird that people don't ever seem to get tired of seeing Federer win. Right? He's won more major championships than any other player, and yet most tennis fans around the world just continue to pull for him to win over and over and over and over again. But what's weird about this is that this attitude that people have towards Federer, right, this desire they seem to have to want to see him win again and again and again and again, is very different from what we seem to see in team sports. Right? In fact, in team sports, it's just the opposite. Right? The teams that win more than all the other teams are often vilified. And this was captured really nicely by this graphic from the website SB Nation, in which they compiled the number of tweets in which a sports team was mentioned as the evil empire on Twitter. And as you can see here, right, the teams with the most mentions, the New England Patriots, the New York Yankees, and the Golden State Warriors, these are the teams who, at the time, had just been winning more than all the other professional teams. Here's other data showing who people were pulling for in the Super Bowl a few years ago based on geotagged Twitter posts. And as you can see here, right, what seemed to matter to most people was that the New England Patriots did not win another championship. So we thought about all this, right? We took all this in, and that led us to this question. Right? Do people prefer dominance by individuals to continue more than dominance by groups? And what I'm going to show you is that not only do people show a bias towards individual success, but that bias ends up having meaningful consequences for how we think about wealth and inequality in society. But where to begin, right? So after we had this initial conversation, we wanted to gather some data. But one challenge we had was that we had to ensure that any result we found in any experiment we ran wasn't due to any kind of prior allegiance or prior familiarity that people may have had with any individual or group who may be succeeding. So that led us to a sport called Calcio Fiorentino. So this is a very obscure sport. It's played only in Italy. The object of the game is very simple. There's two teams, and they're just trying to move a ball from one side of a dirt field to another. But the sort of defining feature of Calcio is that there are no fouls, right? So players are free to contact each other however they want, including kicking and punching. It's been called kind of a cross between rugby and mixed martial arts. But because, right, no one in America has ever heard of Calcio Fiorentino, we thought this would make a really good domain in which to test our idea. So we recruited participants for a study on how people perceive success. And we told one group about this Calcio team from Milan, who we said had won 5 consecutive Calcio championships, and about how they would be competing for their 6th championship. Or we told people about how Calcio is actually played as this sort of individual one-on-one sport, and about how one of these players, Roberto Moretti, had won 5 consecutive individual Calcio championships, and about how he would be competing for his 6th championship. And what we found is that people wanted to see the individual streak continue more than the group streak. Right? So people wanted to see Roberto Moretti continue his streak in individual Calcio more than they wanted to see the team from Milan continue their streak in team Calcio. And keep in mind, right, we found this result even though the participants in our study had no prior opinions or rooting interest, right, for any of the individuals or groups who they read about. What's more here is that we also gathered data to show why this happens. And what we found is that when a group gets on a streak, right, or some really impressive run of dominance, it can be difficult to pinpoint sort of who or what is really responsible for that success because there's just so many different people involved, so many different moving parts, so many different kinds of situational factors, right, that can explain or account for team or group success. So for example, if you think about a team like the New York Yankees, it can be difficult to figure out sort of what exactly is responsible for them having been so successful over the years. Although one explanation, right, is that they just tend to have more money than everyone else, which is really just sort of an advantageous situation that they tend to find themselves in. But when an individual is succeeding, it's not at all difficult to figure out who is responsible, right? We likely credit all of the success of someone like Roger Federer sort of directly to his singular talent and hard work as an individual. So consequently, right, I think individual success, as opposed to team or group success, may send a stronger signal that we're witnessing something that is really pushing the boundary of human potential. And as a result, we're more likely to feel a greater sense of awe at the prospect of seeing individual success continue. And because awe is a positive emotion that we like to experience, we therefore want to see individual success continue more than group success. So after we started studying this phenomenon, we started noticing it in a lot of different aspects of society, right? Not just in sports. And specifically, we started to wonder whether this may have real consequences for how we think about wealth and inequality in society. And here's what I mean. So in our culture, right, we tend to venerate individuals who have had tremendous economic success. So for example, these kinds of mega successful individual investors, like Warren Buffett and Benjamin Graham, have achieved almost guru-type status in our culture. But the opinions that people tend to hold about these kinds of mega successful individual investors are very different than the opinions that people tend to hold about mega successful investment groups. Right? Typically, people tend to hold not very favorable opinions about mega successful investment groups. And to really highlight this, a recent article noted that, according to polls, Goldman Sachs has been enjoying a 4% favorability rating. Now, this contrasts really nicely with another public opinion poll suggesting that Warren Buffett has been enjoying an 89% favorability rating. Now, there are lots of reasons, right, for this particular discrepancy, right? Not the least of which is that Warren Buffett is a very folksy, likable sort of guy. But given the results of our earlier work, it struck us that if we're imagining a successful individual at the top of the economic ladder, as opposed to a successful group, then we may feel that it's a bit more justified for the people at the top to have accumulated vast amounts of wealth as compared to the people at the bottom. Right? Or in other words, we may just feel that economic inequality is a little less problematic when we're imagining a successful individual at the top of the economic ladder. But again, right, how to study this? Well, we realized that Forbes magazine has already kind of done this experiment. So Forbes is constantly putting out these issues of their magazine that highlight the top billionaires. Right? These issues of the magazine really idolize these people who have just had this sort of continued, overwhelming success in some area. And sometimes, right, they feature a wealthy individual on the cover, like this one here. And sometimes they feature a group of wealthy people on the cover, like this one here. And so we ran a study in which we either showed people this exact issue of Forbes, right, that featured 7 billionaires on the cover, or we showed people one of 7 different covers that featured just one of the 7 billionaires from the group cover that you see here. And then we asked people how fair they thought it was that these people had accumulated the amount of wealth that they have. And what we found is that people thought it was more fair for the billionaires to have accumulated the wealth that they have when they were viewed individually on the cover than when they were viewed all together as a group on the cover. What's more here is that we also asked people how much they would support an inheritance tax in their state at that moment. And we told people that an inheritance tax is a policy that's used to reduce wealth disparities and that it typically affects people at the top of the economic ladder. And what we found is that people who viewed the group image were more likely to support an inheritance tax in their state than people who viewed one of the individual images. As a follow-up to the Forbes study, we ran another study that was very similar using real data about global economic inequality. So the nonprofit organization Oxfam recently released a statistic showing that the combined wealth of the world's wealthiest 26 people is now equal to the combined wealth of the world's 3.5 billion poorest people, and that the wealth of the world's wealthiest person is now equal to the combined wealth of the world's 500 million poorest people. So what we did next was we just randomly assigned people to read about one of these statistics. So participants either read about global wealth inequality framed as a group at the top, or they read about global wealth inequality framed as an individual at the top. And we found the same pattern of results that we found in the Forbes study. Right? So people thought the inequality described in the Oxfam statistics was more fair when it was framed as an individual at the top rather than a group at the top. And people were also less in favor of implementing an inheritance tax in their state when they read about a wealthy individual at the top of the economic ladder as opposed to a wealthy group at the top of the economic ladder. So what the data from these studies makes clear, right, is that how wealth and inequality is expressed and presented can make a real difference in terms of how people feel about it. And one place where I think that this can actually be seen as having played out in real life is in this language that people started using about a decade or so ago during the Occupy Wall Street movement to describe the people at the top of the distribution as the 1% or the 0.1%. Right? This language really stuck, right? And we still use it all the time. And I think the adoption of this language may have marked a sort of modest cultural shift in which we started having a bit more concern about inequality as an issue. You know, up until this point, inequality was not really a commonly discussed issue, right? You know, some people cared, right? But it wasn't as much of an issue as it is now. And part of the reason for that may be that this language that we continually use of describing the people at the top as the 1% helps us to feel like the people at the top are more of a group. And therefore, we may feel that it's a little bit less fair for those people to have accumulated the amount of wealth that they have, and we may be a little bit more interested in reducing wealth disparities. And reducing wealth disparities is something that we should really consider doing because economic inequality has been on the rise in America for some time. So, for example, the amount of wealth controlled by families in the top 10% has more than doubled in the last 30 years, whereas the amount of wealth controlled by families in the bottom 50% has actually decreased some. And this is a problem because countries with higher economic inequality are more likely to experience a whole host of negative societal outcomes, such as higher homicide rate, higher infant mortality rate, higher bankruptcy rates, lower overall well-being, and even lowered commitment to democratic institutions. So economic inequality is a problem that we would be wise to address. And it's clear that who we're led to consider when we think about the top of the economic ladder may have a real influence when it comes to persuading us whether or not to adopt any number of policies that could potentially narrow the economic gap. And so anyone who has a role in communicating information about wealth and inequality, from policymakers to members of the media to nonprofit organizations, needs to be wise about how they choose to convey this information to the general public. So what did we ultimately learn that day, getting sidetracked talking about Roger Federer? Well, the way that our minds react to the success of individuals is very different than the way that they react to the success of groups. And that ends up having meaningful consequences, right? Not just for sports, but even for how likely we may be to address big problems such as economic inequality. Thank you.